on the Requa side refused to bring them across the river in their canoes because they knew they were taking them to the concentration camp. So the Indian law was at that time is that if you own a boat and someone's on the other side, you had to go get them. You couldn't just go nanner, it's like, especially again a stranger. You're ferrying across the river, and they could pay you. I mean, there was that kind of stuff too. But they refused this time. They refused to ferry them across the river because they knew where they were going, the concentration camp. So they were puddled up on the south side of the Klamath River for a few days. Well, in the meanwhile, of course, people ran off or whatever, got caught and brought back. Well, this one young man got away, and he got up the Klamath River and took off and made it clear to Peckmore. And so he hid out. And he went to a man's house named Kerr. He was a Hashkayi. So Kerr took him in, right? Well, what is his status? He's a Chenosh, right? He wasn't one of his cousins, he wasn't a nephew, he wasn't a family member, he was not from his village, he was a Wiyot or a Wailaki. Yeah?
So can that also be a stranger?
Yeah, it's in this case. So then finally the cavalry told okay, you two women, swim the river then. Men swim the river and they washed out the mouth of the river and drowned him. So the men all go, okay, we'll go ferry them across the river. They're going to do that today. So they did. They ferried them all across. So by that time, the young man had gotten away. So he's up there living with Kerr up on the Peckmore. And so about this time in history, a huge, really bad influenza or something went amongst the people. They got high fevers, and they all knew that the day that they got that fever, and so many days they died. Anyway, so since he was a Chenosh, and he was welcome to be there. Now the Chenosh is what? They would be the canoe paddler, the duck plucker, the hunter, the woodpacker, the water carrier, But when they were old enough to be married, he would buy them a wife. I mean, they weren't like pent up and made to live in cages or anything, but they just had their status, right? And so then that's when he would, he would take care of him. And if they went to war, he'd fight for him. That kind of stuff. But he's still, in terms of the strata of society. And so anyway, unfortunately, it's a very sad story, but so he got the sickness and he got really hot. And so Kerr knew that then he was going to die. Because everybody else who got this fever died. And I'm not sure what it was. It was probably about this became a reservation 62. So it was in the 1860s when this happened. And so he got really ill. So Kerr told his Michashkai, go dig his grave. Because they knew it was coming anyway, right? And so then they used to lower him in the grave was on a plank, with ropes on it, and they lower him down. You have to lift him out of the hole 3 to 4 times because it's like you're giving birth back into the earth. That's what, like you're passing out of your mother while you're passing out into your mother, right? Anyway, so they go through that and they lower him down the grave, So he goes, Kerr, what are you doing? And Kerr goes, I am burying you. And so he was buried. So he would spread the disease to the rest of the village. Anyway, those are harsh times that, call whatever, harsh makers, but that's Chenosh. And there's great stories. There's one it's called The Way We Live, and it's about one village had to settle this problem, so he ended up becoming a slave. And then the headman, everyone says, oh, you can go home and visit, Because they weren't, like I said, they didn't whip them, and it wasn't that kind of a relationship. But one day he was fishing on the beach, and he noticed that every time he'd go for smelts, he'd get a little further and further away, and so of course he'd always come back. But this one time he ran away, and the Hashai says, he's done, so he got to go home. They paid off their debt, whatever. But so society was like this, and so to say that we didn't have register in our language is completely wrong. There was a register of speech that these people owned. And at Nadash, this is what's supposed to happen is that in Nadash, during intermission, when you have a dance and a break, the Chashkayu are supposed to stand before the people and elocute to them. It's called Chwenesh. It's to give a speech. And they're supposed to elocate to them about life and prosperity and the goodness of being alive and welcome to this place and encourage the people to be happy and rejoiceful. And so this is called Chwenesh, and that is to orate. And they would get up and speak to the people, and then the line would come out, So this is a piece of the Chashkayu. So, that's why we definitely know we're part of the Pacific Northwest culture. We're not a Californian culture or Pacific Northwest.
Are there any remnants of that kind of structure today?
No. I mean,
At all?
you know, we do storytelling, that's about it, but no, but it will be Sunday, right? Yeah, so that's the old structure right there. So this is where language class, and I think what my estimation is that high class language just means that, not just means, what it means is that you have full inflectional ability. You can take anything that your mind is thinking about and transform it into a noun or a verb. Just, you know, and say those things you need to say. You know, you can truncate things together, you can compose new things. And I watched two linguists fight about this in 1995. My master, who I was being trained under, was Tom Gavon, and he was going up head-to-head with Victor Gola, and who was an Athabascanist, okay? And he's also an anthropologist. And so he knows the grammar very well of the Dee-ni grammar, the Dee-ni grammar. And so Tom was learning our grammar, right? And I'm the speaker of the language, that I was kind of the victim in a sense, or whatever, because he was always drilling my head about how to say this and say that. Well, they got in a big fight about this, because Victor goes, I have documents from the 1870s from Hoopa Valley, a list of words that, you know, people collected or whatever. And he said, a Dene person, if they're in a certain situation on a certain day and the event's unfurling in a certain way, they will say that verb exactly the way it's happening. Just like when he said, all the kids are playing in unison versus the kids are playing separately. So that requires a different verb form, right? And if they're running up the hill versus down the hill, they're running outward or inward, or they're, you know, they're running together against each other, all that information gets trunked into that word. And he goes, that word may never be used again, because it never will fit that exact event that happened at that moment in time. But when they say it, everybody knows what they mean. See? And so he said, so no, Vic, no, Tom, you don't get to just take a word and you don't like this part and just erase it. No, that's there for a reason, and it got crystallized, you know, got fossilized into that. So it was a blast watching these two wizards fight it out. Because they're two brainiacs, right? And they're big old professors, and they've written, you know, bunches of paper, they're big old PhDs, and there's like fire like going through the air, you know. And finally Tom's like, okay, I get it. And he finally conceded to Victor, because Victor just kept kicking his hind end. Because every example he tried to come up with, Victor was, you know, and just leveled it. And so you, particularly with our grammar, you don't get to just take parts out of it and clean up the data, because every consonant means something in this language. The t, look at that, the t means passive, right? You know what I mean? That one t means passive in the right position.
You know, when Jim Collins was here,
Mm-hmm.
I felt like when he spoke English, and I listened to him, I couldn't understand him, because his language, you know, his register seemed so, you know, the vocabulary used and the way he said stuff was like, it was like Greek to me almost. Like,
Yeah, he was talking shop,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
The
Oh,
linguistic
yeah.
shop, right?
Yeah,
Probably,
that's
you
like-
know. And the same would be with an attorney today or a doctor, you know. Well, then was no different then, you know. And to be an Indian doctor, a high-class D-nun, you had to know every joint and every bone, every organ, you know, a part of the body to heal it. See that vocabulary? Where's all that vocabulary?
Where
you know?
would they be on
The
social
D-nun,
structure?
the D-nun are right in here. They're like right, the D-nun would be like right over in this area. They're kind of like in a D-nun, okay, the healers. They're high. They're very high. And then right down here, below here, would be like your, what do you call those, the, there's little,
like their assistant or?
well, no, the Trahan were people that were artisans.
Oh.
So if you needed a canoe built, or if you needed a woodpecker roll fashioned, you know, these people had very specific knowledge, and they were hired for their expertise. You know, so they were like the artisan class, or the guild, the workers' guild maybe, or I don't know, it's compared to today's world. So there was a class of people here, the Trahan, the people you paid for their service. You know, so the D-nun, the Indian doctors, the shamans, right, and the Trahan. So they all floated around up in here, you know. These people had full marriage. These people could have, if they needed to, half marriage. You know, those kinds of things happened. You know, they were still legally married. They were just half married.
Did you say one of our ancestors, the grandfather
If you're
couldn't
high class,
afford the
you have
dowry,
to
so
buy
the
your
children were
wife,
considered illegitimate because
but
he
your wife
never
has to
could
pay for
afford
you.
what
Oh,
she was worth?
no, that was at Requa.
Oh, okay, I
Requa.
remember you telling that.
Right, and the
If you're
family
lower
was
class, you
so
said that marriage is like, I don't want
wealthy
to pay for my wife.
that even though he paid as much as that would be way beyond a normal person's range, he could never legitimize his own children. I mean,
Even
that's
though they were
pathetic.
married.
I mean, yeah, they were
Yeah,
married,
yeah, but-
and he was their father, and he paid big cash, but it was not enough
Not
to
enough
meet
for her.
the and so they had a bunch of
Oh, it was Requa, okay.
bastards, yeah, a bunch of bastards from that, even though they weren't
Right,
but they
right.
just couldn't legitimize it, I mean. Yeah, so that's how steeped our culture was.
Yeah.
I mean, it was amazing, how it was at that time. Anyway, yeah. So I think speech register goes along with all of that, kind of back to this where we were. But you might be thinking of when I was sharing that when Joe Hostler and John Hostler were brothers, right, from Hawanquet, and they went to Enchua to buy wives. Yeah. It was a big flat, and so they had to go back 3 times.
Oh, yeah.
See, the first time they went, the dad said,
Okay.
"Whatever,
Yeah.
it's like, are you joking?" Yeah. And so they went back to Hollandwood, and then they gathered up more stuff and came back, and he shooed them away again. And then the 3rd time they came back, he goes, "Okay, now we can talk business," And so then they bought Drew Lytra and Triquesta, the 2 sisters. And then they married the 2 brothers. That's Hollandwood. So that's negotiated out ahead of time.
Yeah.
That's a part of the whole negotiation part for this whole structure that existed at that time. So that's how we get to be related to all those people.
What's the Drew Light Tree on who? What's his other sister's name?
Tree, Quest, Knock.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Tree place?
Tree,
That's the right.
Quest, Knock.
I guess I didn't take it.
Yeah, Tree, Quest, Knock. And her sister was True Live Trick. 2 passives that work.
Yeah.
So we got
It's a hard working effort.
True
Yeah. You can also
Live
move down if you're lazy.
Trick. Okay.
And
so-
True Light Tree was siblings to
Or if I say if I was
Sudaju.
rich, if I was rich and you were my son and you kept doing a bunch of bad things to people, I would keep paying people. Like we might become low class people because
And
we
there
no
were
longer
5
have
more
money,
kids. But
and no one respects
so
us anymore
Sudaju,
because
True Light
my
Trick.
son
So
was an
what's
idiot
sweet
and
about this? We
killed
were just
people
talking
and
about passives.
insulted
Check out this.
people or was lazy.
I'll show you
All
this.
resources and
Yeah.
disrespecting.
Yeah. Because it wasn't like every single word that came out of your mouth, you were responsible for. And if you said something bad to anybody, you were responsible for it.
So earlier we were saying true lu means fishing, and it turned to true lu. So you recognize that? So then this has been changed to true lu. Okay, and then they've added something out here. This means female, lady. Okay, or woman. Okay. All right. So because you can't name somebody, you can't take a noun or a verb in our language and use it exactly. You have to modify it a little bit to make it a name, right? So instead of true lu tret, it turned this to lie. Okay. Now that name belongs to her. She carries this for her life, right?
You want to take a break now?
Okay, yes, thank you for the reminder. And so True Lytra is now her name, and she carries that for the rest of her life. She's not True Lutret, which could be. She's not True Lune, she's not True Lune, she's True Lytra. True Lytra, and it sounds nice too, True Lytra, So, and then this is Tree Kwasna is the huge drying tray, this open woven. The small ones are called kasi, plate. Right? These are the big ones. Tree Kwasna, and they just changed that number to Tree Kwesna. See? So it's not. So her name is Tree Kwesna, not Tree Kwasna. So that becomes her name. Yeah. Anyway, so this is naming. Now that's how it goes off in a little different vein, But this is inflection.